Hi everyone, Dr. Liz here. Welcome to the Hypnotize Me podcast. I'm glad you're here and hopefully it will help you with your journey along the way. I've been an entrepreneur for most of my adult life. I built an award-winning company that was a household name in South Florida, then sold it, and then focused mainly on my private practice as a psychotherapist, helping people feel better. I specialize in hypnosis techniques for anxiety, sleep, emotional healing, some habit change. All of my experience gives you a unique perspective. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ Dr. Liz Bonet, Bonet. Another way is to buy one of the downloads that I have for sale on my website, drlizhypnosis.com, DRLIZ hypnosis.com. I only have a couple up there, but they're really good ones. They've stood the test of time. And if you're looking for some free downloads, subscribe to the newsletter and you'll get free hypnosis downloads to reduce anxiety and to increase emotional stability. You can listen to those immediately. Start helping yourself today. But listen to this episode first before you do that. Another way to support the podcast is to rate and review it on iTunes or Spotify or wherever it is you're listening to it. That always helps me get found by people, which helps me help more people. So you're going to help me help more people. I'm going to wrap this up. Enjoy the episode, and I hope to see you back here soon. Hi everyone, Dr. Liz here. Today's interview is with John O'Connor. He is the author of The Secret History of Bigfoot, Field Notes on a North American Monster, which was an NPR and Chicago Tribune Best Book of 2024. It's quite an award. His articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, GQ, Men's Journal, Financial Times, Boston Globe, all kinds of great places. He was born and raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and has an MFA in nonfiction writing from Columbia University. He currently teaches journalism at Boston College and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And his latest book is A Short, Strange Trip, an untold story of magic mushrooms, madness, and a search for the meaning of life in the Amazon, published in April of 2026. So we're here to talk to him about his new book and experiences along the way. Let's jump in. Hi, John. Welcome to the Hypnotize Me podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yes, glad you're here. I just did an episode on microdosing of mushrooms in particular.
Mhm.
But so when I saw the request for an interview about your new book come along, I thought, yeah, that's a great one. It'll go really well with what I just published on the podcast. So why don't you tell us some of your background? And I know you're a writer and a journalist. It makes me a little nervous interviewing you, but
Well, why is that?
well, it's like, oh my gosh, he's a professional,
Oh no, I know no, I mean, I'm maybe a journalist with a lowercase j, but I do teach journalism at Boston College. I haven't worked in daily journalism in a number of years. I mean, I really have been writing books for the last 5 years or so. I used to consider myself a travel writer. I mean, that's how I kind of cut my
Hmm.
teeth, and that was my bread and butter for many years. I did a lot of travel writing for the New York Times and the Boston Globe and the Financial Times, and but then during the pandemic, I got into writing books. All that sort of travel stuff, for obvious reasons, kind of dried
Yeah,
up. And my agent encouraged me to write a book. So I wrote a book. My very first book was about Bigfoot.
I saw that.
Yeah, it's called The Secret History of Bigfoot. I did not imagine myself ever writing a book about Bigfoot, but I came to it in a kind of strange and roundabout way. And it's a writer that I really admire named Peter Matheson, who's been dead for several years now, but mostly known for having written The Snow Leopard, a nonfiction account of hiking in the Tibetan Himalaya.
Hmm.
He had an encounter with what he considered to be a Yeti. And Pete Matheson, if your viewers don't know, was just a kind of uh, literary kind of man of the sort of late kind of 1990s, early 20th century New York, kind of literary demi-monde, and but a very sane, sober person. And the fact that he had that experience and was curious about it kind of gave me a green light to look into it. And so I ended up going around the country and hanging out with Bigfooters who go on expeditions looking for evidence of this elusive, shadowy creature. And
Wow.
I'm sort of a portrait of somewhat oddball kind of marginal community. I'm
Mhm.
really interested in the American experience and especially you know corners of the American experience that tend to get overlooked or kind of dismissed out of hand. And so my next book was about psychedelics and folks who sometimes, not always, but sometimes refer to themselves as psychonauts, which is kind of
Mm.
explorers using psychedelics to explore the kind of outer reaches of the mind and imagination.
Yes. And that one
And
was just published like April 2026, correct?
yeah,
And
yeah,
we're
it just came
recording
out.
this in June 2026.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it is, I look at that through the lens of a kind of forgotten, another long dead but forgotten kind of guru of the psychedelic 70s named Terence McKenna, who
Mhm.
I claim gave us several important ideas that led us to our current moment, our current psychedelic renaissance.
Fantastic. Which are what? What do you feel like has led
So,
to this renaissance? Because I do have a feeling, I mean, I had this impression that there's a renaissance in psychedelics, and I'm in my 50s, and I haven't done psychedelics since college in my 20s, right?
yeah,
You sort of grow up and have kids, and you're like,
yeah,
yeah, I'm not taking an acid trip in my 30s and 40s, right?
yeah,
Even though in my 20s, I was like, oh my gosh, I had this friend where like, we should do this once a year, the rest of our lives,
yeah,
you're inspired, and then that
yeah,
dropped away with
yeah,
pregnancy. So it is this feeling though of it's coming back, not just ayahuasca, but LSD mushrooms, but also the concept of microdosing, which I
mhm.
referenced earlier, of okay, this general sense of let's use these psychedelics to increase happiness in a world that doesn't feel so happy right now.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head right there. I think it has a lot to do, well, two things I would say, partly with the mental health crisis. I think
That
it's
too.
kind of
Mhm.
undeniable. And there's been a great deal of good research, like really good research in the last 10, 15, getting on to 20 years now of looking at psychedelics, therapeutic potential for treating people, and not just anxiety and depression and end of life anxiety, for terminal cancer patients and so on. And now they're having a great deal of success with MDMA and ibogaine, which is a West African shrub
Mhm.
to treat people with PTSD. Um, and the other thing is that, but partly connected to that, are kind of time-honored prejudice against these drugs, that
Mhm.
which has been been with us for the last 50 years since Nixon launched the war on drugs in 1971, we're starting to become a little saner and more sober, if you will, with respect to these drugs and their potential uses.
Mhm.
They were once thought to be embody everything that was wrong with America, and now we're realizing that that was not only wrong, but potentially far more dangerous of a concept than the actual concept that it purported to be fighting, which was that these drugs are bad for you. It turns out I mean, it's not that everyone should be taking them all the time or anything. They do
Mhm.
there's potential negative consequences, and we can maybe talk about that. But
Yes.
yeah, but they have been shown, certainly anecdotally and definitely in the clinical setting, to be very helpful for very many people.
Yes, and there has been a resurgence of research on it. So it's banned for decades, even doing research on them. And
Yep.
then, the ketamine in particular, they've done research on for depression, like treatment resistant depression.
Yep.
And so I think that's opened up some of the other pathways there
Yep.
for research on the other on psychedelics in
Yeah.
particular.
Yep.
So yeah, I've been following it sort of here and there. I get advertisements for, be a therapeutic guide. There's some licensing that has to go on depending on what your state you're in as a psychotherapist or psychologist. And I haven't really been interested in doing that part of it. It's
Yeah.
more like personal interests in terms of what's going on here and
Yeah.
seeing
Yeah.
my friends do it again and in their 50s. And it's like, what's
Yeah.
going on here? So let's
Yeah.
go back to McKenna. What do you think is the foundation there?
So he was, just to give your viewers some a little background, or your listeners, is he was a very strange kind of iconoclastic figure. Grew up in a small town in Colorado in the 50s and 60s, moved to Berkeley, and at the end of the 60s, started college, didn't finish until many years later. But he was a brilliant, somewhat troubled figure who discovered drugs really early on, probably too early. It's like one of
Mhm.
the great ironies of young people discovering drugs is they're arguably it's the wrong time, when your
Mhm.
brains are still plastic and malleable, and really, in a lot of respects, many respects, we're probably better off at our age doing them than when they're young. At least that's what I keep telling my kids,
Me
and
too.
my
I
and my
tell my
students
kids,
also.
wait till
Yeah,
you're 25,
yeah, yeah,
like,
exactly.
at
Yeah,
least. Right?
um, yeah. But so Terrence, he 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 was an author, a speaker. He was a brilliant guy. He was just a self-taught polymath, really. Just and
Mhm.
he had a lot of great ideas. He had some totally crazy, batshit ideas also. And unfortunately, it's the crazier ones that have gotten more attention recently. But I claim in my book that Terrence gave the kind of psychedelic underground three important things that led us to our current psychedelic renaissance. And the first of those, most obviously, and I hear there's a big caveat here, which when is that it was really, I suspect it was his brother Dennis. He had a younger brother who was
Mhm.
4 years his junior, named Dennis McKenna. Um, and I really have good reason to suspect it was Dennis who figured this out, but Terrence always took credit for it, and he was the better known one. But they together, I think, were, if not the very first, then among the first to figure out how to cultivate magic mushrooms at home.
Okay.
It's weird to think about in their current ubiquity, but really, even in the 60s and 70s, psychedelic mushrooms were a novelty item. Like
Mhm.
you could get LSD, you could get MDMA, you could get synthetic DMT, but you couldn't get mushrooms. Like basically had to go to Mexico to get them. And even
Mhm.
Timothy Leary, his famous first experience with psychedelics was in Cuernavaca with psilocybe mushrooms. So
Mm.
Terrence and Dennis, through trial and error, figured out how to grow magic mushrooms at home and began selling them and giving them away in vast quantities to friends in the early to mid 70s, I suppose. It's hard to kind of pinpoint exactly because we're talking about a Schedule One substance that
Yeah.
could send you to jail for a really long time back then.
Yes.
And that spiked a seismic shift in the underground. So they really gave us the mushrooms and I think that can't be overstated. Certainly, other people were dabbling in that, but they were at least among the first, if not the very first, to figure this out. One other thing they gave us was this idea of psychedelics as almost a religious sacrament, which again, a
Mhm.
caveat here, they sort of took that from indigenous Americans and most notably the Mazatec Indians of Oaxaca, who had been using psilocybe mushrooms for at least several generations, if not a couple hundred years, in the religious ceremonies. So this idea that what we were talking about when we were young and we took them just for fun, just to get
Mhm.
high, just to explore and kind of shift our mind state a little bit, suddenly they became this acquired a religious use, meaning they were to be used for something greater than just mind expansion.
Yes. I have
And then,
seen that reflected in
yeah,
some of the literature I'm reading, or you know, forums I read or something like that. Like
yeah.
it's considered sacred plant medicine, quote unquote.
Yeah, you hear that over again. And even
Yeah.
the very first university like clinical study to get approved to look into psilocybin use to treat anxiety and depression was at Johns Hopkins in 2006 under the late great Roland Griffiths. And
Hmm.
Roland came up with he just passed away a couple of years ago, and he's a really formidable figure in this movement, and a great deal is owed to him. But he came up with this questionnaire that became known as the mystical experience questionnaire, afterwards patients were subjects, I should say, were asked to rate their kind of the degree of their mystical experience. It's a 30 question questionnaire, and this idea of a latent mysticism or spirituality associated with psychedelics um, became not just part of the experience, but somehow connected to the project of wellness um,
Hmm.
and healing. So, and Terrence, although there's a little kind of twist here because Terrence didn't see them as necessary for therapeutic use. He
Mhm.
probably himself needed a little bit of therapy. He was a very troubled guy, as I said, but he thought that he didn't necessarily think they should be used for that towards those ends, but he set us on that path, I claim.
Okay.
Um, and then the last thing he gave us, which is maybe the most controversial thing I claim, was this idea of kind of magical thinking with respect to psychedelics and the willingness and even eagerness to um, discard reason and rationality when it comes to the psychedelic experience in
Mhm.
favor of one's subjective interpretation, which is,
Mhm.
completely makes sense because that's part the subjective experience is part and parcel of psychedelics. William James, the great American philosopher and sort of founding figure in American psychology, always talked about the noetic experience, meaning if it's true for you, who cares if it's true for anyone else? If it's
Mhm.
objectively true, it's sort of irrelevant. Especially if it can help you achieve what you're trying to achieve and help with, in a step towards wellness or some sense of equanimity, which a lot of people are using psychedelics for,
Yeah.
which is great. But one of my claims in my book is that psychedelics, that's where it should end, and that psychedelics should not be the basis of a worldview or the basis of a sort of Timothy Leary inspired approach to politics and social
Mhm.
cohesion or something like that. That's a leap that I worry that is sometimes made, that we expect a little bit too much from psychedelics.
What do you mean? Like people are expecting it, if we all do psychedelics, we'll change the world? That kind
Yeah,
of
that
like
old like sort of
flower
hippie
child
dippy,
70s
yeah, the whole
thinking?
70s, 60s, 70s
Okay,
dream that
got it.
psychedelics that Leary proselytized for, that Terrence proselytized for
Okay.
years, and that's psychedelics have a lot of uses, I think, and they have a lot of great things to
Mhm.
offer us. But I'm afraid that I think that is not one of them, that we make a mistake in assuming that they are a kind of panacea for everything that ails us.
Okay, and that comes from this sense of um, connection and openness that people get when
Yeah,
often when they do psychedelics, like we're all in this together and we're all one. And so
yeah,
if we can exist in peacefulness,
yeah.
then the world will be a much better place or fixed, quote unquote. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's totally fine, and there may be some truth to that. We all know if we've taken psychedelics, we know that feeling of like what Ram Dass called the dropping of the mask. Leaving
Yes.
the mask
Yeah.
behind and just seeing the world as it truly is. That feeling equanimity of connectivity to others.
Mhm.
Um, that I think that's undeniable, and that's one of the beautiful things that psychedelics deliver to us. But that's
Mhm.
not all they deliver. Sometimes they deliver the exact opposite, and
Yes.
which is
Yeah.
the bad
Well,
trip, which everyone who's really experimented with psychedelics always has. And eventually that's also part and parcel potentially of the psychedelic experience. And
so that's more like the bad trip is what
yeah,
you're referring
exactly.
to. Okay, like
Yeah, yeah.
eventually if you do them, you will have a bad trip in some kind of
Chances are,
aspect.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
Terrence did too. I mean, the funny thing he was kind of not very honest about is he didn't use psychedelics for most of the last 10 years of his life. He had a really bad experience on
Mhm.
psilocybin mushrooms one night, and he was too terrified to use them again. But he continued to sort of evangelize on their behalf for many years. And not only that, but Terrence was famously weatherproofed against these drugs. I mean, he was a very serious user of these drugs, and had a kind of chainmail armor in many respects, until all of a sudden he didn't, and then he
Mm.
had a very bad experience, which was a life-altering one, really. And he continued to proselytize on their behalf and to his followers and listeners, and not only that, but suggested that people do them alone in the dark, which is, I think, how most people would not recommend. Most professionals would not recommend you do them
Yeah,
today.
right.
Um,
Yeah, it's
he
true.
was a funny guy in that way. Is he had this great, wonderful, insightful, beautiful ideas that quickly sort of bled into these weird rabbit holes that wasn't entirely. He would just become a not entirely honest and
Mm.
sober narrator in many respects. So
Mm. The unreliable narrator, huh?
yeah, yeah. And he also, he thought psychedelics were, he had this whole thing called the stoned ape theory, which Terrence thought that this is just a theory, but that when early hominids emerged from kind of jungles in East Africa onto the savannas. They found psilocybin mushrooms growing. Psychedelic mushrooms tend to do very well in the dung of hooved game and cattle.
Hmm.
And its theory is when early hominids found them, they began eating them, and this led to a huge leap in cognition and intellect and sexual prowess, and led us from being kind of led us into to being Homo sapiens. And so there's really no evidence to support this at all. But the point is that he thought they should be used towards those ends to further us along on the sort of continuum of evolution.
Oh,
Uh,
very interesting. Okay,
yeah,
some really interesting ideas, huh?
yeah.
All
Oh,
right. So did you have your own personal experience with them then when you were writing this book?
yeah, I did with mushrooms. I mean, I had, as it sounds like you did, a lot of psychedelic experiences when I was young, probably too young, beginning in high school, 16,
Mhm.
17 with LSD. And then I think happens with many people. LSD is a much harsher kind of experience than psilocybin, and I did, maybe 10 times or so, and then I had a couple of very bad trips,
Mhm.
and then the psilocybin mushrooms. I had one or two experiences when I was younger, and then more recently, when I was writing this book, I grew them myself.
Mm.
Thanks to Terrence and Dennis, you can now anyone can do that at home, basically in their closet.
Yeah, they sell kits. I actually
Yeah.
have a friend who, it's a friend of a friend. Her son like funded his college education by growing mushrooms in his dorm room.
Oh, wow. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's
We
hilarious.
always laugh about like, oh yeah, he had a whole small business that was quite
Yeah,
profitable actually. Yeah.
yeah, that's great. I mean, yeah, you can do it really easily, through the mail, and I mean, they are maybe of
Yeah.
dubious interstate legality, but it's fairly easy to do. And I grew them um, and took quite a bit of mushrooms over the course of 2 or so years. And
Okay.
yeah,
Like what they call macrodoses. Macrodoses
yeah,
now, what they call that is more a higher dose for like spiritual experiences
yeah,
versus these microdoses are more for almost like it's a tiny, tiny dose and it's more for enhancement of daily living, but you're
yeah,
not high.
yeah.
Okay.
I would say, well, so mine was very uh unscientific, but it was, yeah, there's a great book about microdosing you probably heard of by Elliot Waldman called A Really Good Day. So that's the kind
It
of go-to.
is the funniest book,
Yeah, yeah.
actually. Like
That
very,
is
very funny. Yeah. And it
that
is
is
good.
the text for this stuff, and I would refer your listeners to her and to that book. But yeah, so I would, I experimented with it, and but I didn't call it microdosing. I wasn't doing it quite every day, and I wasn't doing it for therapeutic reasons. I was just
Mhm.
doing it to see what all this hype was that people were talking about.
Yeah.
Um, I did really tap out, I have to say, after a month or so of that. I just grew tired of it, the strange almost like noetic haze that the mushrooms put you in. You're not tripping, but there is a shift in perception.
Mhm.
And I got tired of that, and wasn't working particularly well, writing that is on it. So it became
Mhm.
kind of untenable after a while. And then I did do a couple of macro doses also, and those were fine. I have to say, people are often disappointed to hear this, but have never had the full-blown mystical hallucinatory experience. I mean, I've eaten a lot of mushrooms and done a lot of LSD and MDMA and stuff, and I just had never really had that outer body, like, that people describe in the
Yeah.
therapy sessions, from seeing your own body out from on high and looking down and grappling
Mhm.
with your inner demons. And I just always had a lot of fun, like that, and that's kind of how I approach them. And
Mhm.
I do worry sometimes that maybe, again, I said this before, but that we expect too much from them, and I
Mhm.
can encourage people, don't forget to enjoy yourself, and you don't have to
Mhm.
wrestle with all your innermost baggage, like
Yeah.
go to the
Yeah.
beach and go for a swim or something, and walk in the sand and
Mhm.
just revel in this magnificent world that we live in. And I
Mhm.
think that that's one of the things that psychedelics really offer us, is just to remember what a how precious life is, how miraculous it is to be alive now.
Yes.
So it's sometimes Again, going back to the kind of mental health crisis, I think people are desperate and they are out of options and they want this option, and I think they should
Mhm.
definitely have access to it. But
Well, it is interesting in terms of the mental health crisis. I actually had not really put those two together of like, oh yeah, the rise of this is because of that.
yeah,
In particular, I was thinking more of this sort of general unhappiness with the world and life and that type of thing.
yeah,
Um, but for sure, yeah, I think people are unhappy with antidepressants as well. Like they have found that they're not as effective as originally they thought, or sometimes they're not for them at all, or
yeah,
they want to do something that they feel like they don't have to take the rest of their life.
yeah,
And often they are looking for this sense of they want a really good day, like the
yeah,
book, right?
yeah,
Like, or
yeah,
just a good experience, like some fun in their
yeah,
lives.
yeah, yeah, totally,
That
yeah,
that seems
and what,
harder to access these days
yeah,
with regardless of the reasons for that, right? There could lots of
yeah,
reasons we can theorize on, and not just theorize. There's been research around social media and the phones and all of this stuff. So
yep.
like getting away from that and having this experience that's not related to technology
Yeah,
either.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, and I think yeah, with antidepressants, a lot of people plateau. You have their side effects, the loss
Mhm.
of libido. Yeah, so I think and as I understand some of those SSRIs people start to plateau and the
Yeah.
efficacy is kind of diminished over time. And
Right.
yeah, the very first there's I think a reason that the very first psychedelic it's not a classic psychedelic. It has less kind of intense existential headwinds than LSD and psilocybin, but MDMA was the very first to cycle through the FDA's very labyrinthine approval process.
Mm.
And that is because of its efficacy to treat PTSD, especially in our Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans. And that is one of the main reasons it got as far as it did. It
Mm.
didn't pass, but there's a good chance it will. Now we have not just people, the usual suspects on the left, but now people on the right,
Yes.
including Trump, who signed an executive order in April fast tracking psychedelic therapies for youth, especially with an eye on MDMA and ibogaine to treat war veterans. And
Yes.
so yeah, that's it's good. It's fine. I mean, it's great that we're in this place. It's taken too long, a half century to get here, but it is
Mhm.
strange to me that some of the figures who are involved on this, and not to, it's people on the left and the right everybody has their own agenda, but
Mhm.
you could argue that Trump is probably the most Nixonian of all of politicians, to come along in the last 50 years, and the fact that he has turn the tables on the war on drugs more so than any other administration is really fascinating. It just shows you how desperate people are and how far we've come, and how much more we're hopefully listening to what people who are in distress are telling us.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I do find it interesting that you never had like a mystical experience with mushrooms. The one time I did them in this is right after I graduated from college, and I took a motorcycle trip across the country, and
Oh,
I
cool.
at one point we were in Oregon. It was the Oregon Country Fair, which has historically been known for being very hippie, let's say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I didn't feel much of anything when I did the mushrooms there. And then so I never did them again.
yeah,
Honestly, it's like, why would I do that? They sort of taste really bad and I didn't feel much.
yeah, yeah,
But I attended a professional seminar on hypnosis for mystical experiences. And their take on this was like people are wanting them and they can get them without psychedelics. And I don't know. You can absolutely can have mystical experiences with hypnosis. I'm not debating that,
yeah,
but it's very different than anything I experienced with in my youth with LSD or something like that. Like very
yeah,
different. That you're
yeah.
not really getting to the shift in brain chemistry.
Yeah, and they say you can with breath. I've never tried this, but with breath work, they say also you can get a kind of that same uh
Yes, that's
similar
true.
similar experience. Yeah, but I
Yeah,
find that kind of
ecstatic
hard to believe.
dance
But yeah,
as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But I mean, I see that as like temporary, very temporary. So
yeah,
you're not looking at hours or a day. You're
Yep.
looking at, I mean, even the longest hypnosis sessions I do, which are more in the spiritual realm, are about 2 hours.
Hmm.
Sometimes three. They used to go three, but honestly, that's too tiring for me. So I got them down some, like, nah, let's keep this manageable. And
Yeah.
you get some after effects of that
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
you're retaining that experience, a spiritual, mystical experience, and the information and knowledge that you gain from that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I would sometimes describe it as somewhat of a post session high.
Mm.
But again, it's a very different than having the trees speak to you, let's say, right?
Sure. Sure.
Like or this knowledge or this feeling that we're all interconnected, and almost like this bodily feeling that people describe with psychedelics, actually.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny in the so my Terrence my subject went to he had this formative experience in the when you said dancing, it made me think of this. Much of my book concerns a trip he took to the Amazon basin into a part of the Colombian Putumayo,
Mm-hmm.
which is the Putumayo is a kind of tributary of the Amazon. And so this is like southern Colombia, northern Peru. The Putumayo is a river that sort of creates the border. And he went there with his brother and some friends in 1971 in search of a indigenous hallucinogen, a DMT containing plant called ucahe, which he didn't find. But he did find magic mushrooms there unexpectedly. They weren't expecting to find them, but there happened to be at the time, and there were until pretty recently, Jesuit missionaries in this little village that they visited called La Chorrera, and the missionaries kept cattle,
Mm-hmm.
and so the mushrooms grew in the cattle poop, and Terrence and his brother found loads and loads of them, and took them for weeks and weeks, and along with ayahuasca, and they were smoking a lot of weed. And they eventually, Terrence and his brother undertook what they called the experiment at La Chorrera, which was this huge psychedelic kind of mind-blowing space odyssey it's sort of hard to describe what they were trying to do exactly, but
It sounds like
um,
they were doing a lot of psychedelics.
yeah, there's too many psychedelics and good intentions, and they had recently lost their mother. They were 21 and
Mhm.
24, and they
Oh,
were essentially, I think, grieving for mom and
yeah.
attempting something pretty intense and outre there, but very sort of maybe on par with kind of 1970s surrealist kind of hippy dippy thinking, and not to try to undercut what they were up to, it was without getting too many details that they were up to something weird. But if you so I went to La Chorrera for my book for 2 weeks and went to and hung out with the same tribe and among some of the people who recalled them being there in 1971. And we I got hung out with shamans,
Hmm.
including a mother and daughter, octogenarian mother and her daughter who had been apprenticing as a shaman under her for 14 years, I think. And they
Mm.
told me some really interesting things that really surprised me as somebody who's sort of imbibing the whole psychedelic thing in ayahuasca from the West. First of all, one of them, the daughter had never used ayahuasca. It totally terrified her. They use it occasionally, but not for therapy. They use it to communicate with the deceased relatives or to try to find lost objects, to have luck in the hunt.
Hmm.
There's a whole panoply of other psychedelic plants that they use, including ukuhe, which they grow in the garden like we would grow hyacinthia or something, hyacinths or something like that. And
Hmm.
but another the big all this talk about sacred plant medicine, the most sacred plants in their whole cosmology are tobacco and coca. Those are the plants that they take every day in
For a lot of the
combination.
world too, right?
Yeah, and
They're
tobacco is
most sacred plants. Yes.
yeah, and it's funny. Tobacco is one of the oldest cultivated plants in the Americas, grown in the town of
Hmm.
Columbus from Alaska all the way to northern Chile, and they take it every day with coca, which is not the chewing the leaves, but ground into a powder that almost looks
Hmm.
like matcha, and they take it. The men take it. The women don't take it, but they do use tobacco. Um, but they also like the indigenous medicine cabinet is dancing and singing that they
Hmm.
do it for days to whip themselves into a kind of exotic, kind of ecstatic, I should say, rather, state. And again, they're banging the drums, Mangure drums, to communicate with people deeper in the forest. And it just was a real shock and kind of illuminating experience to see the actual indigenous ideas around psychedelic plants and just drugs generally versus our own
Mhm.
conception of them. There's considerable daylight there at times. So not always, I think, as starkly um, as I may be making it out to be, but generally speaking, I would say there's considerable discord between the Western idea, what psychedelics are used for, and the indigenous experience.
So,
Um,
so you're saying that there's much more, what strikes me is there's much more community experience of that,
yeah. Do it
right?
together. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
always together. It's not generally for wellness or healing, although I suppose you can argue that the downstream effect of it, of communicating with neighbors and relatives and deceased loved ones, like is maybe therapeutic in some sense, but it's not it for a
Yes.
therapeutic sense that we think of it, I think.
Okay.
Uh,
So not like I'm going to take this and be better. Not
yeah,
that kind of sense. More like this is part of our lives and allows us to have some communication or special skills for the hunt
yep,
or something like that.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So it's more integrated, it sounds like, to their community and their way of life versus for us, it's more
Yeah,
the sense of a one shot. Unless
yeah,
people are microdosing, that's more of an integration to your daily life. But
yeah,
most of us think of psychedelics as like, okay, like you're saying, like take it, have fun, go to work, then the next weekend decide what to do, right? Or the
yeah,
next
yeah,
year or twice a year or whatever that
yeah.
is.
It's
Versus,
not a one and done deal. Yeah, they spend an
yeah.
immense amount of time. I mean, first of all, making tobacco, growing, cultivating it, making and growing and cultivating coca, grinding it.
Mhm.
Like one of the first nights I spent there was, or several nights we spent in the Maloka, which is it's got a steepled uh, communal house that's built sort of woven from palm leaves, and but there's a specific Maloka. There's different Maloka. There's a Maloka to make in coca. There's a Maloka a few miles later to make and ingest ayahuasca. There's another Maloka just for hanging out on the weekends, and it's so. But it all has the kind of say they're steepled for a reason because it's pointing towards the heaven. It all has a spiritual context in a sense.
Mm.
But it's hard to say how front of mind that spirituality and mysticism is, depending on which drug or which plant we're talking about.
Yeah.
But um, but the
Well,
symbolism is there for sure.
it's interesting that you bring up they use it to communicate, or have contact with people who have passed on. And I think that is often a huge yearning, longing for when people lose
Hmm.
people. I do, like I said, I referenced a little bit earlier, beyond quantum healing, which is a spiritual technique where sometimes people do feel like they are having contact with significant loved ones that have passed on, myself included. When I've done the technique as a client myself, of
Yeah,
having contact with my dad who passed on and other spiritual guides. And so for me, it's like extremely comforting. So I could see
yep,
how, if people wanted to use psychedelics to do that. I heard another instance. It's actually a guy who was, I didn't go to the seminar, but it was in-person seminar for the Florida Society of Clinical Hypnosis, and he was really grieving. He had lost a son and really grieving. I know the brief version because my mentor had heard him talk before and also went to this educational seminar with him where he's really just depressively could not get past this and use psychedelics to have this sense of connection and eventually move on the grief from the death of his
yep,
son and feel like living again. We're talking about
yeah,
this sense of connection with people who have passed on and what an incredible use of that is. And for them, it's more of daily. For us, it's like, can we do that? In the Western world,
yeah,
like, is that possible? And,
yeah,
beyond a
yeah.
certain segment that feel like, okay, spiritually, we're connected there, right?
Yeah, and grief is a big part of this. And to be honest, I didn't realize that until when I started writing this book. I just thought I was going to be looking at Terrence
Mhm.
and tracing this path of his ideas to when I was working on the book, and I write about this in a middle chapter, my son fell ill, who he was 4 at the
Mm.
time. He's fine now, but it was very kind of harrowing experience in and out of hospitals and stuff for the better part of 6 months. And it's kind of ending still just now, as seems to be kind of finally at the
Mhm.
tail end of things. And he, fortunately, we live in Boston, which has
Yes.
Boston Children's Hospital, which is one of the great hospitals in the
Yes.
world, and people come from all over to bring their. And I have to say, for my wife and I, it was really the first time as parents we'd ever experienced like real suffering, like real sadness and grief in not just for our son, but for ourselves in a way, our inability to
Yes.
help him. And really for doctors and nurses to help him, despite all their best
Mhm.
intentions. And we were just really helpless, and we felt completely helpless. And that was really shocking to me, that feeling of like, um, it's just us, me and my wife and my
Mhm.
son, and my daughter, and there's nothing anybody can do. And that made me realize, I write about this again, not that psychedelic, like my son should have hit
Of
acid and that would have
course.
made everything better.
Right.
But just that psychedelics like offer people potential help when there is none. The sort of usual material
Mhm.
approaches um, have done nothing for them or done very little, and it seems to deny them psychedelics in that context seems completely sadistic to me.
Mhm.
Just because there's potential for negative outcomes, there are potential for negative outcomes in lots of medical
For sure.
interventions,
Yes.
and I think that people should be, not to be expected to wait around for legislators to kind of make up their minds about these drugs if they really need them.
Mhm.
Yeah. Anyway, which is just to say that I think people can really benefit from their use. I think they should also be
Mhm.
careful. Like these drugs have good effects and bad effects. They have good uses and bad uses. And I heard Michael Pollan say once at a psychedelic convention that the Greeks have a word for psychedelics. The Greeks took
Mm.
psychedelics, and they had a word for, or at least we suspect they did. They had a word for drugs called pharmakia, which means both good and
Mhm.
bad, and it requires kind of holding two ideas simultaneously, competing ideas in our mind at the same time. And I think that's important to keep in mind,
Yeah.
and even front of mind when we're talking about psychedelics. But they do have, in my own experience, potentially remedial application with
Mhm.
grief and sadness and that sense of loss and helplessness.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed. I mean, there's been enough reports about that yeah, the potential is there for sure for someone who's going through that. My youngest has pretty severe health problems and long COVID and all kinds of things. And it is a feeling of helplessness sometimes of, what's going on here before they even figure it out. And actually, luckily, one good thing about being in Jacksonville, Florida, is the Mayo Clinic, who did figure out what's going on with
Okay.
her because it was years
Yeah.
and 14 doctors if you add them all up and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But it is a certain feeling as a parent. It's awful. It is suffering, like you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Um,
yeah,
yeah.
and so
I was just gonna. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, and so in terms of psychedelics, you're saying no one's going to like dose a minor. No one's recommending that we dose a minor here, but you're saying as a parent, maybe that could be helpful to get that sense. Is that what you
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah, just to get some relief when none is forthcoming
Got it.
anywhere else.
Okay.
Actually, I think I still have a flyer somewhere. I can't remember where I picked it up, but there actually is some research into juveniles and
Mhm.
psychedelics. I'm not, I don't know anything about it, but I do know that that is something that's talked about, and I maybe even researched in a clinical setting. I'm not sure, but on the flip side of that is I also write about this. My father, who is kind of lifelong alcoholic, at least since his kind of 20s, and battled alcohol and depression for much of his life. He's now in his
Mhm.
80s and tried every kind of remedial approach from, 12 steps to um, detox centers and all the medications and so on. And towards the end of his life, largely at my behest, tried two different psychedelic therapies. First,
Mhm.
ketamine at a clinic in Michigan, licensed clinic, and then psilocybin with a guided therapy that I sat in on in
Mm,
Michigan. And in the latter really to kind of disastrous
mm,
effect. I mean, not only did they not help him, but it arguably made things worse. I
mm,
mean, he was in pretty bad shape to begin with, and maybe too far gone to be helped. But for some people like my father who are in real distress and have tried everything else and have been convinced that psychedelics are a last ditch attempt at
mhm.
wellness and equanimity, and they don't deliver, that could be kind of quietly
I can
devastating or
see
not so
that.
quietly
Yeah.
devastating.
Well, Tim Ferriss,
And
the
there,
author of the 4 Hour Work Week, is another
yeah.
famous person who, I think it was ayahuasca though, where he felt like he
Mm,
was able to finally kick alcoholism with the use of
mm,
ayahuasca. So it is
yeah.
interesting. It does have potential there. And in the microdosing episode that I did, she also refers to that people are moving out of addiction with psychedelic use and find it helpful for
Yeah.
that. Um, so yeah, very interesting the potentials. And again, it's like I think now we're finally being able to research it again and have some real studies around it, which in my mind can always be helpful. Not that the personal
Yeah.
experience isn't really important, like you referenced. There's something to the
Yeah.
personal experience is just as valid as 1,500 people doing psychedelics and
Yeah. Yeah.
conglomerating that experience. But it's
Yeah.
also interesting to hear like dosage and this and that, and what did it help and what did they find it not helpful for. And I think that research is forthcoming. So
Yeah.
we're coming to the end of our
Yeah.
time here together, but I did want to thank you for sharing your personal experience and also your professional experience with it. Please tell people the name of the book again and how they can find it.
Sure. Great. Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you. So it's A Short Strange Trip by John O'Connor. They can find it at their, local booksellers, online at the usual places. They can also, well, they can find me and links to the where to buy the book at johnmoconnor.com. If they want to read about me, read a little bit more of the background of the book and my work generally, they can find that there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And that will be in the show notes for everyone and on the website. So, again, thank you for being on the podcast.
Great. Thanks for having me.
I hope you truly enjoyed today's episode. I work all over the world doing hypnosis, so if you're interested in working with me, please schedule a free consultation over at my website, drlizhypnosis.com, and we'll see what your goals are and if I can be of service to you in helping you reach them. Finally, if you liked today's episode, please subscribe to the podcast or tell a friend. That way, more and more people learn about the power of hypnosis. This podcast is not mental health treatment, nor should it replace mental health treatment. If you need therapy or hypnotherapy, please seek treatment from a trained professional, such as myself. Have a wonderful week. Peace.